All right, we can go ahead and get started. You all good, Nadia?
Yeah.
I will introduce now. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 2020 Engelsberg Annual Lecture on International Order. My name is Andrew Earhart, and I'm delighted to introduce our speakers this evening. First, I'd like to thank our sponsors for this event. First and foremost, the Engelsberg Applied History Program, which is run through the Center for Grand Strategy at King's College London and the Center for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. Our other sponsor tonight is the Strategic Studies theme within the School of Security Studies at King's College London. Just a bit of background on the Engelsberg Applied History Program. We began in the autumn of 2017, and our aim since then has been to bring more historical study to bear on pressing questions of international politics. Each year, we host 2 annual lectures, one in applied history and another on international order. Earlier this term, Professor Rana Mitter of the University of Oxford delivered the lecture on applied history, which is now available on the Center for Grand Strategy's YouTube channel. Tonight, however, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Nadia Schadlow, who will deliver this year's annual lecture on international order. Her talk is entitled Strategy, the Pursuit of Freedom of Action. Dr. Schadlow is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and a visiting fellow at MITRE. She was most recently U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategy, where she helped to author the 2017 U.S. National Security Strategy. You may have come across some of her recent articles in The Atlantic and Foreign Affairs, all of which are enlightening reads, which I highly recommend. And they both speak to the idea of U.S. foreign policy needing to prepare for a new age of great power competition. Dr. Schadlow studied at Cornell University for her undergrad and then earned an M.A. and a Ph.D. from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She will be joined by Professor Brendan Sims, who will offer some comments on her lecture. Professor Sims is professor in the history of European international relations at Peterhouse College, Cambridge. He is also the director of the Center for Geopolitics, which is our partner institution in the Engelsberg Applied History Program. He is the author of numerous award-winning books, among them Unfinest Hour, Britain and the Destruction of Bosnia, which was shortlisted for the Samuel Johnson Prize in 2002. He's also the author of 3 Victories and a Defeat, The Rise and Fall of the British Empire, as well as Europe, the Struggle for Supremacy, and a recent biography of Adolf Hitler, which I highly recommend. So when thinking about who to ask to be the respondent for this lecture, Professor Sims naturally came to mind, given his brilliant historical scholarship, as well as his knowledge of contemporary American and European politics. So just a few administrative notes. This lecture will be recorded, and Dr. Schadlow will speak for around 30 to 40 minutes, or excuse me, 30 to 35 minutes, and then we will hear from Professor Sims. After that, we'll have a question and answer session, and please feel free to post a question in the chat or on the Q&A function, and I will relay that question to Dr. Schadlow as well as Professor Sims. And we'll aim to wrap up around 70 to 75 minutes from now. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to Dr. Schadlow.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I appreciate that introduction. It's a pleasure and a great honor to join you this evening at King's College and at Cambridge. One of the few benefits of Zoom is that I can actually be in 2 places at once. I'd like to thank the Center for Grand Strategy and the Center for Geopolitics at Cambridge and the Engelsberg Applied History Seminar for inviting me to give this 2020 lecture. I would also like to personally thank Andrew, Dr. Maeve Ryan, Jess Carden, and Professor Sims, who also have worked with me on making this possible. Of course, I only wish I was actually there instead of in a town in Connecticut, which is just named after a place in the UK. Nonetheless, that will have to suffice. Ever since Sir Michael Howard founded the Department of War Studies in 1962 there at King's, King's has been a gathering place for military historians and strategic thinkers. Today, your alumni walk the halls of Parliament and Whitehall, Army barracks and Navy wardrooms, advancing ideas about national security around the world and contributing to the flourishing of democratic societies. King's is also home to the Liddell Hart Center for Military Archives, where Sir Basil Liddell Hart's personal papers and correspondence are located. It's difficult to overstate the impact that he made as a strategic thinker, especially given that Sir Michael, Sir Lawrence Friedman, and Professor Brian Bond counted among his students and friends. In my lecture this evening, however, I'd like to take you across the channel to another contemporary friend, to a contemporary and friend of Liddell Hart's, the French military officer and strategist, André Beaufre. And excuse my pronunciation, I'm trying. In 1965, Beaufre wrote a slim volume with a long title, An Introduction to Strategy, with a particular reference to the problem of defense, politics, economics, and diplomacy in the nuclear age. Liddell Hart, who wrote a preface to the book, believed that Beaufre was one of the most promising officers that he had come across, calling the book the most comprehensive and carefully formulated treatise on strategy that had appeared in a generation. There are many insights in that book, and I'm sure many of you in this audience have even read it. But there's one in particular about which less has been written. This is Beaufre's view that the essence of strategy is the struggle for freedom of action. I especially liked that phrase when I came upon it. I'll repeat it. The essence of strategy is the struggle for freedom of action. I found myself thinking about how it might provide us with greater clarity in our thinking about strategy. It captures, in my view, much of what we need to be aware of today as policymakers and strategists. A view of strategy as a struggle for freedom of action means the freedom to pursue those activities of commerce, of political discourse, and of social life described by Anglo-American traditions and our constitutional histories. Without freedom of action, military forces could not deploy to deter conflict or respond to aggression. Without freedom of action, governments and businesses could not exchange the data that is the lifeblood for our security and the global economy. Without freedom of action, we could not speak openly about the value of democratic norms and ideals. We must sustain freedom of action over time to ensure that our political, economic, and military choices do not narrow incrementally or catastrophically, such that we find ourselves with no choice, or the costliest of all, which is war. Beaufre's framing of strategy in this way obliges us in the West, and especially the United States, to consider three uncomfortable propositions that have policy implications. First, his observation reminds us that strategy is inherent. It is not a list of desirable goals or plans. Strategy is a struggle of wills between dynamic thinking actors. We want to keep our freedom of action, which our rivals want to constrain or deprive us of. Second, it means that there is no neat end state. Like geopolitics, strategy is eternal. As Sir Michael Howard pointed out, our acts create new sets of circumstances, which in turn require new judgments and decisions. We may achieve momentary successes, sometimes even stretched over long periods of time, but there will always be pushback, and it's likely that unexpected events will intervene. We never achieve a final, uncontested freedom of action. And third, given the intertwined nature of the political, military, and economic domains today, we must compete across all of them simultaneously. If we lose freedom of action in one, it will likely have a negative impact on the others. In sum, then, strategy is competitive, continuous, and comprehensive. Let us now turn to each of these three propositions to draw them out a little bit and consider the implications going forward. First, strategy in its purest form involves competition. It is about creating leverage and wielding power. Strategy constantly evolves in response to other actors pursuing their own purposes and implementing their own countervailing strategies. Perhaps one of the best ways of thinking about this is Edward Luttwak's term, the paradoxical logic of strategy, where successful actions cannot be repeated since the other party adapts in response to ensure that the same outcome cannot be gained in the same way again. This characteristic, Lookback believed, means strategy is an art characterized by instinct, talent, and adaptability, not a science where outcomes are repeatable on demand. Bofra, like other strategists, appreciated this as well. He saw strategy as fundamentally a dialectic, the interplay between opposing wills. So for every action proposed, reactions must be calculated. This might seem obvious to most in this audience, but trust me, in many policy circles, the recognition of the competitive core of strategy is not a given. It is not an underlying assumption that goes into how many approach foreign policy or national security issues. I remember an illustrative incident early in the Trump administration where I served. General H.R. McMaster, then President Trump's national security advisor, and Gary Cohn, then the chairman of the National Economic Council, had published an op-ed criticizing the notion that a global community existed. They argued that world politics was an arena where nations, non-governmental actors, and businesses engaged and competed for advantage. It elicited a vitriolic response from many in the policy elite. You would have thought that the op-ed had asserted that the world was flat. There's a tendency to conflate planning responses to complex problems such as climate change or water scarcity or even pandemics, with strategy. All of these challenges are real, highly complex, and certainly require coordination and cooperation. But we need more than a plan when challenges are accompanied by active competitors trying to keep us from our objectives. Sir Lawrence Friedman has also written about this, about strategy being about choices, not mechanisms to connect means to a specific definitive end. The difference between plans and strategy matters because the application of inflexible plans to dynamic competitions neglects the agency that competitors, rivals, and enemies have. And we must remember this in peacetime as well. Peacetime requires strategies as well. The 2017 National Security Strategy of the United States captured this fundamental link between strategy and competition. I had the opportunity to lead the development of this strategy, what I will refer to in this talk as the NSS. I can tell you firsthand that it was a shock to much of Washington when we put competition front and center. The NSS identified great power competitions against revisionist powers as the central challenge facing the United States and our allies. It acknowledged that we were a superpower with enormous advantages and momentum, but that this success had also bred complacency. It was our view that a belief that had emerged among many that American power would be unchallenged and self-sustaining. The American policy community had taken our political, economic, and military advantages for granted, while other actors had steadily implemented their long-term plans. This complacency explained why we had stood by while other countries exploited the international institutions that we had helped to build. These competitors subsidized their industries, forced technology transfers, and distorted markets. The NSS set forth the necessary first steps to respond to this competitive reality. It did not deny that there were areas where cooperation was imperative, such as climate change, but it called out the competitions that were driving events in the world. The NSS acknowledged that these many challenges differed in nature and magnitude, but that they were fundamentally contests between those who value human dignity and freedom and those who oppress individuals and enforce conformity. It reminded us that having an America that successfully competes is the best way to prevent conflict. Just as American weakness invites challenge, American strength and confidence deters war and promotes peace. In drafting the document in the spring of 2017, it was important to clearly identify the competitive landscape we faced, because, as you know, the first step in developing the strategy is identifying the problem at hand. During its development, there were, of course, many meetings. After all, what is policy making and strategy making without meetings? Many of them. During these discussions and upon its publication, concerns arose about its direct tone. Concerns about how, by calling China and Russia competitors, could be escalatory. So I was often asked, for whom is the document really being written? The answer was easy. It was a strategy written for the American people to be understood by them. Why? Because in democracies, strategies cannot be sustained without the support of the people. Successful strategies require popular assent and participation. The idea of strategy as involving external pushback is not a popular one, but the American people needed to understand what was at stake and why it mattered. Many wish to see the world as they wish it to be, not as it really is, but ensuring freedom of action requires the latter. I'd now like to turn to my second point, which is that strategy is continuous. The view of strategy as a struggle for freedom of action means that the need to engage in strategy does not end. Competitors who seek to reduce our freedom of action will long be with us. It is tempting to envision an end state that relieves us of the work of world politics. In the Cold War, scholars talked of convergence between the free world and the communist world. By the end of the Cold War, many envisioned the end of history with liberal democracy ascendant. A consensus formed that a convergence on liberal democracy would lead to a stable international order. As the Soviet Union collapsed, US President George H.W. Bush called for a new world order, or a Pax Universalis, founded on liberal values, democratic governance, and free markets. This presumption of liberal convergence motivated the decision to allow China entry into the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 2001. The hope was that the rest of the world would get access to Chinese markets and cheap imports, and China would get the chance to bring prosperity to hundreds of millions. Many in Washington believed that this would improve opportunities for democratization. It was a win-win. As it turns out, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, had not intended to play by the West's rules. It was determined to control rather than open competitive markets. It did this by keeping its exchange rate artificially low, providing unfair advantage to its state-owned enterprises, and creating regulatory barriers to its own markets. Officials in past US administrations did express worry about this, from 2005 on, I'd say. But most remained convinced that engagement with China would strengthen the rules-based international system, and that China's economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization. Instead, China continued to take advantage of economic interdependence to grow its economy and enhance its military. But this lack of convergence had implications. One is that it means we are not driving toward an inevitable end state, but that we must seek to create and maintain favorable equilibriums or balances of power in key regions of the world. The NSS explained that in terms of the need to establish favorable balances, we needed to look to Europe, the Indo-Pacific, the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa. In each of these regions, there remains much work to do. But even if we succeed, this would still not be the end of the game. We still need to exert ourselves to maintain these balances over time. Again, this might seem obvious to many of you in the audience, but for policymakers in Washington, there is a constant drive to declare definitive wins, to make calls of mission accomplished, and to match funding, and to sometimes even hold it hostage to the achievement of a specific end. Of course, defining ends, means, and ways is the right response to certain situations. If we're responding to a humanitarian crisis, for example, the means are allocated to an agency, an operational plan is ready to deploy resources, and in the end, food and shelter, specific ends, are provided. But in today's great power competitions in strategy, there is an opponent or competitor who seeks to disrupt our efforts and refuses to remain inert. Our competitors understand this. Even during the relative stability of the Cold War, Chinese military theorists and strategists described the contest as one taking place on the silent battlefield. As the scholar Dr. Jacqueline Deal has pointed out, this phrase has consistently appeared in PLA writing since the 1980s to the present, including discussions about how to compete for strategic initiative. Chinese leaders, it seems, understand the imperative to pursue continuously the freedom of action, which Beaufort wrote about. The Russian concept of third-generation warfare also captures similar ideas. Russian discourse often uses the term struggle or barba to refer to the various forms of strategic interactions. For example, their military dictionary includes terms like informational struggle, radioelectronic struggle, diplomatic, ideological, economic, or armed struggle. For Russians, world politics is a dynamic and ever-present contest rather than a static comfort zone. The Soviet Union, of course, had a concept of competition below the threshold of war. For the Soviets, the boundaries separating war and politics were permeable. The contest for political power was as important as conflict. Our adversaries see the continuous nature of competition, and Americans need to catch up conceptually as well. We need an operational concept that allows for flexibility and adaptation and recognizes that a neat end state may not exist. One such concept to consider is the emerging US military idea of campaigning. This is not the traditional military approach of managing a major operation. Rather, this is a deliberate shift to link the various activities necessary for sustained strategic success. In this case, the gerund, the ing ending, is quite important. Campaigning focuses on how the joint force must adapt its activities, not just armed conflict, in response to evolving conditions and policy objectives. It is based on an assumption of continuous competition, and it seeks to avoid a false dichotomy of peace or war. This formal shift began about 5 years ago. Early that year, at the time in 2015, General Joseph Dunford, then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was expressing frustration with the existing phasing construct that had been used by the American military since the late 1990s. That construct broke warfighting down into distinct phases. There were 4: preparing for deployment, shaping the battle space, major combat operations, and post-combat or stabilization operations. In Iraq, as many of you know, these constructs dominated the planning and execution of the war. But 10 years later, frustrations had been growing. By 2015, General Dunford had gathered all of the regional combatant commands down in Quantico, Virginia. Standing around a large map on the floor of the gym, he asked the commanders responsible for Europe and the Pacific, especially, to talk about the phases that they were in. They replied after a pause that they were in phase 0, the shaping phase of the conflict. Dunford then queried, "What phases are Russia and China in?" After some prodding, his colleagues answered 2+. Dunford then calmly asked, "If we are in phase 0 and they are in phase 2, how long before we have a problem?" Needless to say, this led to an interesting conversation that was a catalyst for considering a campaigning approach. It's a mark of progress that the US military is thinking in terms of campaigning, and this is a concept that's still actually very much in development. But success at the strategic level means that broader foreign policy communities must adopt it. In the United States, we are not there yet. Instead, we continue to talk about concepts such as unity of effort or whole of government, or in the UK, I think you call it cross-departmental collaboration. But these are bureaucratic processes. These are plans, not strategies. What if instead we asked each agency to organize its approach around a campaigning construct? In my mind, that would lead to a fundamentally different way of thinking and planning. Doing so, in my view, would accord with what Sir Michael said: peace is not a static state of affairs, but rather a more complex affair than war, which requires constant attention. How well we do this will determine whether we preserve our freedom of action. And finally, Beaufort's concept of strategy as a struggle for freedom of action is important for a third reason. In order to pursue what is best for our democracies, we need to integrate our actions across a large number of domains: the economic, the military, the informational, the technological. We must compete in these domains simultaneously. Certainly in the past, these arenas were interrelated as well. Political and economic conditions have always undergirded the ability to compete, to deter, or to go to war. Athenian strategy in the 5th century BC was predicated on a particular flow of commerce into Athens. and on a set of expectations about their own economy and the economy of Sparta. Strategy is never just about the positioning of military forces in a more advantageous situation. It is about positioning the state and society in a more advantageous situation. The accumulation across these domains of strategic advantage on one side and of disadvantages on the other help define who can win and who will most likely lose a conflict. No one domain is necessarily decisive. As the strategist Harold Rood eloquently put it in the midst of the Cold War, the accumulated effect of many such small advantages may so strongly enhance military capability, the capability to wage war successfully, that victory may approach a foregone conclusion. China has understood this for a long time. When Deng Xiaoping took over as the CCP General Secretary, he propounded the goal of using 4 modernizations to raise the PRC up to world standards of prosperity and into a leadership role. This strategy was rooted in a long-standing Chinese view of the interconnected relationship between economic and technological wherewithal and military power, or between wealth and power. This continues today with the CCP's Made in 2025 plan, which was announced over 5 years ago. It follows a long line of state-directed plans to channel government support and subsidies toward the development and growth of Chinese companies. A more recent plan calls for domestic companies to control not just Chinese markets, but global ones as well. It's focused on 10 key sectors, including robotics, artificial intelligence, energy-efficient cars, all industries expected to drive the global economy in the coming decades. The CCP's civil-military fusion policy requires that China's state-owned enterprises and even its private companies act at the direction of the party. Boffa, of course, would have likely appreciated this interdependence, since he wrote about the need to consider strategy's various elements, not only the military, but the political, diplomatic, economic, and even psychological. Certainly, the UK recognizes this as well. I understand from friends that you are in the midst now of an integrated review, which presumably takes all of this into account. But Boffa may have been surprised by just how intertwined these elements are, how 280 characters on Twitter might, over time, and many tweets, diminish confidence in our democratic systems and divide our polities, how poor cybersecurity years later leads to the production of a Chinese warfighting jet, the J-20, that looks like a replica of the American F-22, or how the hollowing out of manufacturing bases means that we cannot produce what we need when we need it. Indeed, today's many challenges differ in degree from those in the past. I would argue that many of the critical domains that will determine the outcome of great power competitions are not firmly under the direction of political leaders in Western societies, which further complicates this problem. Nor can they be in our democratic systems. Key domains of trade, technology, and information are not controlled by the state. What we import and from whom, how technology firms operate around the world, how we communicate with others, these and other domains are in private hands. It's not the national security agencies of our government that are setting some of these conditions that are necessary to compete. Thus, the Federal Communications Commission in the United States sets policies for 5G, which is critical to our ongoing military and economic competition. The Commerce Department takes decisions that affect American businesses abroad. And our private companies that benefit from US laws often take decisions to allocate their capital in ways that are not always in the interest of the United States or our allies. The fact that these domains impact national security creates serious disconnects. Our competitors understand this and often operate at the seams of these institutions, in what some have called those twilight areas. This is why it's especially important that societies, our democratic polities, understand that they too have contributions to make to ensure that we retain our freedom of action well into the future. So as I conclude, I'd like to bring up an observation that the late Colin Gray made. I'm sure many of you in this audience had the chance to know this wonderful man who contributed so much to the field of strategy. Dr. Gray had observed that strategy has to be made and to a degree executed in a process that is always political in nature. Because politics, he said, provides the enabling mechanism for community actions. He understood that domestic politics and strategy were inevitably intertwined. I believe in this context, it's important to make a distinction between politics and partisanship. Just as strategy is the deeper, multidimensional cousin of planning, so too politics is more profound than mere partisanship. Achieving outcomes for a nation will always be greater and more meaningful than achieving short-term gains for a party. In practical terms, this means that in the particularly contentious environment that we find ourselves today in our democracies, we must restrain our tendency to view all policies through a partisan basis. It is vital that we find a way to agree on some fundamental issues in order to establish some continuity of policy and to avoid giving foreign adversaries divisions that they can then exploit. Adjustments are of course necessary and are the prerogative of new political leadership, but we must avoid the common desire to start from scratch over and over. If we achieve a degree of consensus about the nature of the challenges we face, we will be able to build on these accomplishments over time. And this is especially relevant in democracies where changes tend to be incremental. Let's agree then to focus on the aspirational objectives that deliver the benefits to our respective nations, and then apply our best thinking to the strategies that will allow us to achieve those ends. If we do so, we will preserve our freedom of action from one generation to the next. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schadlow. That was brilliant and a great way to start off this event. Over to Professor Sims whenever he's ready.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great honor to be asked to respond to this lecture. Cambridge, the Center for Geopolitics, which I direct, has been the long-term partner, as Andrew Earhart said, of KCL in this venture, and we're part of the Engelsberg program for applied history. But it's a particular pleasure in that context to respond to Nadia Schadlow, who, as we have heard, was not only Deputy National Security Advisor, but also the lead author on the national security strategy. But at the same time, she's also, in effect, been an historian. The importance of history in her work is clear. If you take, for example, her book on War and the Art of Governance, which is about the inability that the US government has found in synchronizing combat and governance operations. She covers no fewer than 15 case studies from history. So I feel, I think, justified also in responding as an historian to what we've just heard, a very rich lecture, and I'll only offer some replies to what Nadia has said. Let me begin with Boffre, I think, if I've got the pronunciation you provide us with correctly, because I think the historical context may also be useful, because of course here, this is a Frenchman, a Saint-Cyrien, who's writing in the early and mid 1960s against the backdrop of the trauma of the defeat of 1940, which I think was his first book, or at least one of his well-known books, but also immediately in the context of General de Gaulle's troubles with NATO and the question of whether France will stay in NATO, which of course is soon resolved, France leaves. And I just wonder to what extent that text, which I think is part of France's search indeed for freedom of action, against the Anglo-Saxons, particularly the Americans, on the one hand, against the Russians, on the other hand. And I think the options there are much more limited than for the United States. So I suppose my question to Nadia would be, to what extent that provides then necessarily a useful guide for the US, whose options more limited though they might be now compared to what they were 20 years ago, are probably greater than those than the audience that Buffer, I think secretly at least, was writing for. The next point I'd like to address is this really interesting question that Nadia raised towards the end, which is the question of sort of the novelty of needing to respond to many different domains simultaneously, societal, kinetic, and so on. And I can absolutely see why you make this case. I suppose the only thing that I would wonder is whether it hasn't always been such. And we tend to think of our modern age or current age as one in which we have, you know, social media, and you mentioned Twitter, and of course, you're absolutely right that various tweets have had a very consequential impact, certainly on the nature of US politics. So I certainly see all of that, but at the same time, if one looks back, just to take an example from history, Andrew Earhart mentioned that I wrote a book on 18th century British grand strategy. There too, you see an incredible range of domains, both strategic. I mean, you know, Britain is active in Germany, the Baltic, the Mediterranean, North Atlantic, India, and so on, all at the same time, but also in other domains, the societal domain, the religious domain, what people believe, values. It's critical now, but it was critical then, whether you subscribe to the established church, for instance. You had a public sphere where the government was trying to defend itself through sponsoring pamphlets. It was in turn being attacked in the public sphere and in Parliament by outside actors, particularly the French, who would be sponsoring pamphlets and, if you like, promoting fake news and, and disorientation within the UK system. The economy, of course, was also a domain of contestation. So a lot of the phenomena that Nadia has been describing were, I think, described by the phrase jealousy of trade in the 18th century. And sometimes when I heard the Trump administration, and this is not a disagreement, as it were, it's just noting a fact, it's very similar to what was being said in earlier times in terms of the importance of the clash of large trading blocs. Now, when we come to the NSS itself, which I think was a remarkable document and a very eloquent, and to my mind, actually rather persuasive one. And indeed, it did mark a shift away from engagement and interdependence towards great power competition. And it really does rank there, I think, with other documents like NSC 68, perhaps on the UK side, you know, the Air Crow Memorandum before the First World War, documents that really make you think differently about policy. I suppose the question that I have is, I mean, all of those earlier documents, in a way, you could ask, to what extent did they identify shifts in geopolitics, and to what extent did they help create the phenomenon that they were describing? I mean, this is a classic criticism, if you like, but an observation certainly made of NSC 68. And I wonder to what extent, I mean, this would be my question to you, to what extent did the NSS not merely sort of diagnose a new phase, but also help to contribute to that new phase becoming reality? Let me conclude with a question which actually arises out of your colleague, in some ways perhaps mentor, H.R. McMaster's classic book, Dereliction of Duty, where of course he described really the failure of the Joint Chiefs during the Vietnam War to provide expert advice. So I would be interested to have your perspective on, from your experience in government, what the role of experts were, perhaps also whether, you know, they were historically informed. To what extent some of the phenomena that HR was describing then still exist today, or are there sort of mitigating structures in place which will prevent the repetition of those errors and flaws. So those really were the points that jumped out to me, and I look forward to hearing your response and to the further discussion. Thank you.